So I have a few illustrations, just like I have in my presentations. And these first illustrations will show who I am and what I come from. When I was a child, I was a bit of a nerd. And quite honestly, I was also a little bit lazy because I was such a nerd. So I learned things very, very quickly. And I also just sucked knowledge like a sponge, basically. Then when I was 14, I started playing wheelchair basketball, and I was very good at it. And I lived an extremely privileged life because soon I started wheelchair racing, and I traveled the world with these sports. Like I said, I was very privileged, but I was not so privileged that I could afford to continue my sports because I had to pay for all my equipment and all my travel. These were in the days before disabled athletes had sponsors, really. So, like I said, I was born in Denmark, and my sports allowed me to travel the world. I had been on 3 continents before I was even 20 years old. And quite by accident, I ended up in the United States. And I say United States because people want to call it America, but America is really only the 3rd largest or the 2nd largest country after Canada. And America is also 2 continents and not just 1 country. So anyway, there I continued to live a very active lifestyle. When I got there, I acquired a motorcycle with a sidecar so I could get around. I also had a car at times, but I mostly like to use my motorcycle for getting around. I played tennis for quite a few years. That was actually my excuse for being in the United States. They would always let me in when I said I was a professional or a semi-professional athlete. So that was a good way for me to travel. But I had a home and I had everything there, even though I was there on a tourist visa. I spent about 8 months a year in the United States and 3 months a year in Denmark. And in the wintertime, I skied for quite a number of years. I attended this, a friend of mine paid for me to attend this adaptive skiing program in Colorado. And he had paid for 3 days for me, and I ended up staying there for the rest of the season, plus the next 3 or 4 seasons, I forget. But I spent quite a few winters in the mountains in Colorado, and it was fantastic. And the organization was volunteer-based, so there were a lot of what do you call it, people from university who were doing their I forget what you call it, their program there. So I usually stayed with those young people. And in the summertime, I really like to go camping, and I was probably camping 1 or 2 months every year. That also meant that I had to hike with my wheelchair, and I did that quite a bit. I also kayaked the local lakes, and all in all, I lived an outdoor life that most people would never get to live, even despite my wheelchair. And I also was very busy doing these things because I knew at some point my kidneys would not last. My kidney disease is part of me being paraplegic, so I knew that I had to live life to its fullest in the beginning of life. And quite honestly, I was quite certain that once I started dialysis, I would be dead. So yeah, eventually my kidneys said, okay, you can't stay here in the States any longer. You need to go back to Denmark and get treated and at least have a nephrologist look after you. So I did that at the end of 2001, which coincided with 9/11, but I had planned it for about a year at that time. So anyway, I went back to Denmark, and there I got my master's degree in psychology, and my master's degree is basically an all-round degree, but I specialized in health psychology after that. And once I was done with my education, I worked in a healthcare facility for people with serious mental illness for about 8 or 9 years until my kidney disease was so bad that I couldn't work any longer. And during those years, I continued my active lifestyle. I went sailing. This is a special sailboat made for paraplegics, or even quadriplegics can sail it. It's a lot of fun. I also went sailing with friends, so there were more people on the boat, but I always liked being on the water. That's also why I kept on kayaking, and instead of skiing, I would go water skiing. But eventually, my kidneys were so bad that I had to stop most of these activities. I still do. And actually, one year I went to Bulgaria and did some paragliding. A friend of mine had a house down there, and that was the most amazing thing I've ever done. I mean, soaring above the earth at what, 3,000 feet, like a kilometer above the mountains, is just fantastic. Very, very exciting. And I continued to travel the world because I knew as soon as I started dialysis, or I thought I knew as soon as I started dialysis, I would be dead. That didn't quite come true. I mean, once I did start dialysis, I went to a conference in the United States that a friend of mine had invited me to. And there I met a number of the best home hemodialysis nephrologists that are on the American continent. And since we're all speaking, I sort of became friends with some of them, and that sort of started me on this circuit of going to conferences and speaking and teaching and doing all of these things. So until COVID, I probably went out and taught and went to conferences 5 or 6 times a year. But that was about it. And of course, it was all about living with kidney disease from the patient perspective. But I've also been involved in a lot of research and things like that. I've done a lot of work on shared decision-making, as well as on treatment choice. At one point, I made an app for the Danish Kidney Association for people to do dialysis, to find out which type of dialysis suited them best. That app later was, we gave it away to the Danish healthcare system because a nurse, a friend of mine, was doing her PhD on a similar subject. So we sort of worked together on that, or I consulted, I should say. She wrote everything herself, of course. So yeah, those are some of the things that what I've done. But now I would like to start on my presentation, the one that I was here to do. I just wanted to show you who I am and what my background is. So let's start with this. I mean, the kidney disease is just a terrible thing, and it's so under-recognized. Even though kidney failure is as deadly as many cancers, it seems to be that so many more other diseases are more interesting. Think of heart disease or cancer or diabetes. They're all much more up in the press, at least here in Europe. Of course, I don't know what it's like in Africa, but I would imagine it's somewhat the same. And I remember my ex-wife once saying to me, yeah, you know, kidney disease is a funny thing. It's just not sexy like these other diseases are. And I think one of the problems with CKD is that it can be difficult to detect. Many think something else is wrong with them before they finally find out that they actually have kidney disease. I know lots of people who have gone to their healthcare practitioner and the person have tested them for this and that and the other, and 6 months or 2 years down the line, they find out that this person actually has serious kidney disease. And I mean, that to me is really sad. But the other side of it is that it comes in so many guises, and it blends very, very easily in with overall poor health, at least for people who are elderly. It can be difficult to detect, and that's the same to me. So the other picture I have for it is the fox, because I think it's really sneaky like a fox. you don't really ever see the fox until you hear that he's in the hen house, and there's lots of commotion and all the chickens are flying around, and you go out there and you find the fox or another predator. But foxes are very sneaky and cunning, and I think that's the same with kidney disease. They definitely also have that aspect to them. And to me, it's very typical for the medical profession to see kidney disease as purely a disease in the body, which in many instances it is. But as a psychologist, I would say it's equally a disease that affects the mind, the way we think, the way we feel, and it also affects our social life. Unfortunately, neither of these two aspects are very often dealt with in clinics and in hospitals, because there is so much to take care of just looking at the physical aspects. So I understand why that happens. Unfortunately, I think in many cases, the psychological and the social aspects might even be more debilitating to the individual patient. But maybe we can discuss that a little later in the discussion. Another terrible thing is that it could hit anybody in the family. Here we have a very happy family, and it could have either one of these people could have kidney disease of some sort, from the little girl to the grandfather, the grandmother. I mean, it's just everybody that are in the risk of getting sick. So that also is rather different from, for example, heart disease, which doesn't strike as many young people, or certain cancers or diabetes and things like that. But when it comes, it's such a shock. Not only is it a shock to the patient who gets the chronic illness, it's also a shock to the family. There's so much to think about. And this presentation will only touch a small fraction of the things that needs to be dealt with both by the patient and by the family, but I will definitely mostly talk about the things that are the domains of psychology and the social life. And I will also say here that very often when somebody gets kidney disease, it's almost worse for the family. I speak to a lot of relatives in my counseling, and often the relatives feel much worse than the person having the disease. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that when we do have very serious kidney disease, when we're stage 4, late stage 4 or stage 5, the disease affects the brain so much that we don't really notice how sick we are. It's much easier for our spouses or our immediate family, or maybe even friends, to find out how sick we actually are, because we're just walking around in this little bubble of being sick that we don't really notice how bad it is. And to many families, I say that kidney disease is actually very merciful, because when you're sick, you don't really know how sick you are. And that is, in a certain way, merciful. It's also very cumbersome, especially to the family. And this is a picture of how it both how it affects the family, but also how it affects your entire life. I mean, that one domino falls, which is the kidney disease, and everything in your life just breaks down. Nothing is like it used to be, and that is just terrible. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Kubler-Ross stages of grief that was developed by this lovely lady, Dr. Kubler-Ross, back in the late 60s. I don't necessarily subscribe to this, her stage theory of grief, because there are better theories nowadays, but her stages in and of themselves have a lot to tell us about some of the reactions to getting a chronic illness, not just serious kidney disease. So I will use some of them in the following when I talk about the feelings that hit us, both us and our families, when we're hit with kidney disease. The first feeling that I want to illustrate here with, I love this picture, I have to say, but it's the feeling of loss. I think everybody can relate to the fact being a little child and you lose your ice cream. I mean, that is the most terrible thing that's ever happened to you in your life up until now. And I would say kidney disease is also the most terrible thing that can hit most people in their lives up until whenever it hits. I know there can be other diseases that might be worse. But the thing is, suddenly you have lost the life that you lived before. There are things you can't do physically because of the disease, but there's also things that you can't do socially, and you will have mental issues that are affected by the disease. So somehow there will always be a before and an after you contract chronic illness or chronic kidney disease, if you may. So a lot of people, they feel denial. They'll say, oh, it can't be this bad. And many behaves in ways that are to their own detriment when they are in denial. In fact, I think we all do to a certain extent. It's very difficult not to have these feelings of just doing whatever you want to do, whether it be eating too much, too many things that are bad for you, or behaving in other ways that are bad, or if you've lost the ability to urinate, to keep your fluids down. I think we all do things. Even me, 10 years later, still try to forget how to be why I'm doing this presentation. It's a way of me thinking, oh yeah, you're not that sick, you can do this. And I think everybody with a chronic illness, no matter what it is, have tried this at certain points. And if they haven't, they should, I would say. I mean, it's part of being alive. And denial can sometimes be a good thing. It can cover over that sorrow that many of us feel for being sick. And for those of you who are not sick, I will say that feeling sadness can actually be healing in many ways. Going into it and a lot where you're miserable can be very good. It can be very soothing on the mind. It only becomes dangerous once it turns into depression, which, I mean, it's difficult to delineate between the two. But if the sadness is just part of the reaction and you don't feel sad, so it turns into depression, it can actually be a very, very soothing thing, even though it doesn't feel like that on the inside. When you're in it, it's sort of like a pressure relief valve. And then we have fatigue. I think anybody with the disease, anybody who's connected in any way, any family, any friends, any healthcare professionals know about the fatigue that comes with kidney disease. And let me tell you, this is not like ordinary tiredness. This is not like working in the field or working wherever all day, coming home, being completely beat. This fatigue is on a totally different level. It's very difficult to even talk about, but it's something that overwhelms you. It just comes and it's there and you can't do anything, and you need to lie down, you need to sleep, you need to do whatever, you know. And I often speak to relatives who are so sad because their deceased relative is sleeping for 16 hours, 18 hours a day. And I have to explain to them that there's really not much we can do about this. This is because of the disease. And hopefully they will get better with proper treatment. And like the disease itself, fatigue can sneak up on you any time of the day and any day of the week. So also, if I fall asleep during this, so then please bear with me, you'll know why. So now we get to depression. Depression is the most prevalent psychiatric result of CKD. And we have a lot of reasons to be depressed. I mean, the disease itself is one thing, and having to deal with everything you have to do for that. But also, our lives are no longer what they used to be. They're no longer what we thought they would be. They're no longer what we dreamed of them being. Our lives have been disrupted. And that is very difficult to deal with. And as relative and as healthcare professionals, all I can say is talk to people about it. That is the best you can do. Find out where they are, what bothers them, how can we help. And the other thing, or two other things, which is basically the same, is if you have time, do some activities with them. Do some activities that makes them happy, or try to persuade them to do activities themselves. There's always something. There's something we can do when we're depressed. The problem is nobody feels like doing it. That's part of the depression. And, you know, it's like if you're overwhelmed with grief and fatigue and depression, it's very, very difficult. But somehow encouraging people to be more active really helps a lot. And also with depression, very often comes anxiety. You become afraid of everything, you know, and you can even be afraid of things that are good to you, like activities like I just talked about. But yeah, it's those two things are awful to deal with. And then we have guilt and shame. People feel guilty for not living up to their own standards and for not doing what they once could do, or maybe what they might have been promised they were able to do. And very often guilt becomes shame. I was once told that guilt is something you feel towards others, whereas shame is something you feel towards yourself. And I think that's very true. They're bed partners, because one easily leads to the other, and then we have this vicious circle of guilt and shame, where you feel guilty because you haven't done what you promised whomever to do, and that is very shameful. The disease itself can also be shameful to many people, just by being ill, but also very often by not being able to fulfill the things that you're supposed to, fill out your role in life. Suddenly you can't be a father, or you can't be a mother, or it's very difficult to hold a job. All of this feeds guilt and shame. And that also means many people get angry. Again, much anger comes from the disease itself. And the thing is, you can't really be angry at your kidney. I've never seen anybody yell at their kidney. So instead, they yell at people around them, which is usually the family. Sometimes also in the clinic, nurses and doctors have to listen to a lot. And one of the triggers of anger is this loss of power. Your autonomy is threatened by the disease. It's threatened by pain. It's threatened by being in the hospital, or having to go to the hospital or to the clinic. It's threatened by fatigue, by not being able to do anything. There's a plethora of reasons for being angry. And unfortunately, most of the time, it's the family that's the victim of this anger. And then we have loss of control. Things are not what they used to be. Your whole life is turned upside down. I've heard quite a few people in counseling saying that they feel like they're living in a bubble. And when I ask them, there are usually two answers. One is that they physically feel like they're living in a bubble, like their surroundings they're not able to reach out to their surroundings. And the other one is that they feel like they are psychologically living in a bubble. Psychologically, they don't have control over anything anymore. And the world or their loved ones is always just a little bit out of reach. They're just exactly so far away that I don't feel like I can get to them. And finally, all of these things lead to stress. And this is, I think, the best image I have found describing stress. It's very often described as the person feel like they're drowning in their emotions, they're drowning in their thoughts. They just can't do anything. They're catatonic almost. And everything, their whole life is overwhelming. And that's sadly something I see very often when I counsel people or when I'm teaching people. So therefore, through the doctors, I have the four most pertinent questions to you guys, and I would love to discuss it with you once I'm done here. I think the most important, the very, very most important question you can ask your patient in the clinic before anything else is, what is important to you? I think those who have tried this, instead of starting to ask about where they are, how they feel, what their symptoms are, if you start out by saying, what is important to you, you have laid the ground for the entire conversation. Because sometimes what we think people want out of a clinic visit is so far removed from what they actually would like out of the clinic visit. And this has been tested by several doctors. And it really changes the way that the rest of the conversation will continue. It also changes the way that lab works. Suddenly, some things might become more important than we thought they were, and some things may not be that important any longer. So I urge you to just try this once or try it for a short period. Start out by saying, what's important to you? Then the next question is, how do we get there? Because some people may just want to see their grandchildren, and maybe that's what you should help them with. And how do we get there? Then you ask, what can you do yourself to get there? What are your resources? And the fourth and final question that I will suggest is, what can we do to help? What can we in the clinic, the nurses, the doctors, the dietitians, whomever, might be able to help to find out, to get the patient to the place that's important to them. So now, I know I've talked a lot about the backside of having kidney disease, and it sort of bothers me a little bit because I actually live a very full and very pleasant and pleasing life. And therefore, I also want to end with this slide of happy people, because there's so much in life that are worth mentioning. There's so much in life that's beyond having a chronic illness or having CKD. And it's up to us as patients, as relatives, and to a certain degree as healthcare providers, to find out what the good things in life are and how we can stave off some of the bad things that I've just talked about tonight. And in my book, it really doesn't matter what those good things are. Whatever floats your boat, I would say to people sometimes. To some, it will be having a wonderful life at home with your family. To others, it might be having friends, having really good, close friends that you can share things with, the good things and the bad things. To others, it might be playing football or any other kind of sports. We know that team sports actually help with help against depression and anxiety. But even if you have to play something by yourself, it's still better than not doing a sport or not being active. It can be eating good food, laughing, joking with friends or family, or even with little children that you meet on your way. It can also be fulfilling your spiritual life, going to church or worshiping in any other way that you believe in or know works for you. To me, life is so full, and it's so full of mystery. And I always tell people it's only a matter of finding that wonderful life and that mystery. And yes, it's hard. And yes, I've been in the pits, but I always remind myself I have to find the good things in life. And I actually, many years ago, started this exercise that has helped me a lot. I was reading some scientific literature on, I think I started reading on happiness, but I eventually ended up reading about these studies on gratefulness. And a number of studies on gratefulness have shown that if you spend just a few seconds in your day, I do it every morning. When I wake up, I open my eyes, I don't get out of bed, and I think about 3 things that I'm grateful for today. Just 3 things. And it can be anything from the fact that I found something on the street yesterday, to knowing that I'm going to have a good breakfast, to waking up and saying, hey, Third World War didn't start today. It can basically be anything, big or little, but the act of feeling grateful actually changes your life to something more positive. And even in the sense that it seems like disease and other things does not affect you as much as if you weren't grateful. And I think I will end my talk on this, and then I hope we can have a really good discussion. I look very much forward to that. So please, I will stop my screen sharing here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Henning, for that wonderful presentation. So if anybody wants to add or for discussion, you can use a raise hand feature, and we'll let you talk, but I will just read one question from Dr. Amar Swali, who is asking, have patient support groups have shown to have any psychological benefit in patient care?
That is a very good question. I don't think I've ever seen any literature on it. I will say that from my experience, patient support groups can definitely help patients understand the disease better and understand many of the things that I talked about today are also things that I do at different venues for the Danish Kidney Association. And I know a lot of people, especially people who are early in their disease, are so happy, not necessarily to come hear me, but to share with the other patients who are listening. Sometimes I think it's very good just listening to each other, just knowing there's a community out there. There are people who have these weird feelings like you do. Mm-hmm. Is it something measurable? I don't know. It would be fun to find out, but I don't think anybody has done any research on it. But I do know professionals who are very happy when they hear people are involved in our patient association, because usually those patients are easier to deal with. And also when there are questions that the professionals cannot answer, they will send them to us. So in that way, I will say it has shown psychological benefit. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another question, and then I'll move to the attendees, to the one who wants to have a talk, then I'll go to the panelists. So the last question from Dr. Amar is, are there any prominent online forum that you can suggest for CKD patients to join and interact with each other?
Yes, I will say on Facebook, there are a lot of groups. I mean, numerous groups. I think the best thing to look for there is to look at the groups that have many members, because usually they are the most active. And then there's one particular group that I like very much. It's an American group. They have a website that's called Home Dialysis Center. So it's obviously mostly for home dialysis patients, but their Facebook group has a lot of members who are just on regular dialysis. And they have a very extensive website that caters to virtually all CKD patients, because it's they have so much information. It's been going on for 20 years, and they just keep collecting information. And they have once a week, there's a blog. Somebody makes a blog post, and I've blogged numerous times. I've blogged about all kinds of things, both things that are very nerdy and very kidney disease related. I also we did a series of blogs with my friend David from a trip we took. He has a transplant, and I have dialysis, and we traveled through Scotland with his wife about 3 years ago, right before COVID. And we blogged, I think we had like 10 chapters or something like that on that. This particular group has other websites. They have one that's called kidneyschool.org, I think it's called, and it's very, very good. It's, as far as I remember, 13 or 14 chapters on all aspects of having kidney disease. And it's written in an English that should be understandable if you have a 7-year education. So it's very simple English, and it's a very good source for everything having to do with kidney disease. I think I will, those are the most important for me.
Thank you. So from the attendees, Abukar Noor, you are welcome. You can unmute your mic and talk. Mr. Abukar, if he's not ready, then can I go to Dr. Joseph Ntarindwa? You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sondergaard, for this experience and an excellent presentation. Actually, a lot of things come out from your presentation. First of all, as a patient, as a clinical psychologist, and I think we have had a lot to learn from this presentation, particularly for chronic kidney disease. But first of all, I would like to congratulate you for what you've gone through, and you've emerged successful from the time you are 14 years old. Life hasn't been very good, but I must say you have the fighting spirit of a lion. Congratulations for that. I mean, going through what you've gone through, and I mean, first of all, as a disabled person, which you refused to accept, and you became an international athlete. And finally now, when chronic kidney disease thinks that they have got the better of you, you are still fighting on. So I think you deserve to be commended for that.
Thank you.
Now, the question I wanted to raise, I mean, all along through your experience, I mean, what you've been telling us about yourself, and that's what seems to have come out, and indeed you are a rock. But what has been the contribution of the family in this process? Because particularly for chronic kidney disease, we do realize that people who don't have family support, they tend not to fight on for a long time. Thank you.
Yes, I think family means a lot, especially when you have chronic kidney disease. I feel like telling you a tale of maybe why I am who I am, because when I was a child, I was always told, whenever I met an obstacle, I was told by my mother, you can do whatever you want. And that was like, no matter what, she would always say that. Even if it was something impossible, she would still say it. And I think that might have fed my fighting spirit, so to speak. But I think for most people, the family means a whole lot because, like I said in my presentation, we sometimes forget how sick we are. And I think it's very important for us and for our family that we are reminded how sick we are, but we're also reminded that there's a life to live out there. There's sometimes it takes somebody to give you a gentle push. Sometimes it takes somebody to kick you in the behind, so to speak. And there is where the family is so important. And even if you don't have family, or if your family is very small, other people, other important people in your life can make the world of a difference. And it can be by kindness, and it can be by motivation, one way or the other. I think it's very important that we have our families. Did that answer your question?
Yes, Dr. Ntarindwa, I think so. So before I return the mic to Dr. Lloyd Vincent, I would like to say thank you so much, Mr. Henning. And from the chat, there are so many messages, people saying thank you, and they are grateful for this presentation. So may I hand over back again to Dr. Lloyd Vincent?
And I will look at all of those messages once we're done talking.
Yeah. So there is a lot actually of today. I think a very important aspect is considering the patient voice when it comes to therapy, decision making, and a lot more things. For example, now you're with the device industry or with the pharma industry. So can you just elaborate a little bit on that, on those aspects?
Please ask me again. I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, there is a lot of emphasis today, which is extremely important when it comes to considering the voice of the patient in whatever you do. Maybe the decision making extremely important. Now therapy extremely important. So can you just highlight a little bit on those aspects?
Yes, I will try. Let's start with decision making, because I think it's very, very important. Of course, there's many decisions to be made. I can mostly talk from my perspective, but it seems like the first decision that has to be made once you start renal replacement therapy is what type of dialysis should you choose. And in my country, we basically have, let's say, 3 to make it easy. We have PD, we have in-center hemodialysis, and we have home hemodialysis. And then there are different aspects of that. But one thing that we sometimes forget, I think, is if a very old person or someone with serious mental problems like dementia or things like that, we also have to consider the fourth option, which is conservative care. Actually, using medicine to keep them alive for as long as possible, because in my view, if you're old and frail, and in particular, if you also have some kind of lowered mental ability, dialysis seems like torture to these people. It's very, very difficult, and especially because they are who they are, they will end up in center dialysis, which means they have to have 2 needles poked into their arm 3 times a week, and they don't know what's going on. And really, so I think one of the things that we have to consider when we talk about choice is conservative care. And then, of course, there's the choice between dialysis and transplant. And I think everybody here agrees that a transplant is far better than dialysis. But we also have to be very careful where we delineate who is actually able to get a transplant. what are the pros and cons of getting a transplant? Because sometimes I think in certain countries they transplant more people than they should, and in other countries we see that they don't transplant enough. Also because there's a lack of organs, of course. And then there's like the psychological aspects. It is such a wide subject. I do believe that I'm talking to you again next week about some of the psychological aspects, so maybe I won't go too much into it. But there is definitely one of the reasons why we're so tired all the time, one of the reasons why we can't think, is because the kidney disease itself, or something having to do with the kidney disease, actually affects our brains. Memory is markedly poorer. Our ability to concentrate is markedly worse. And there are many other cognitive issues that goes with having late-stage kidney disease. And then on top of that, there's what we would call regular psychological things like anxiety and depression. And really, it hasn't been studied none of these things have been studied very well, unfortunately. And I think it falls behind, it's because it falls between two chairs. I mean, nephrologists want to study the kidney. That's what they were educated for. Psychiatrists and psychologists, even cognitive psychologists or people who study brains, are studying brains, and very rarely do they bump into somebody with bad kidneys. And so we just don't have anybody who takes this as seriously as it's supposed to be taken. But we do know a few things, definitely. Like I said, there is a direct connection between having late-stage kidney disease and having mental faculties not working like they should. But I would love to elaborate on that in a week's time. I have what I think is a fairly good presentation on that. Well, does that answer your question, Lloyd?
Thank you so much, Henning. Thank you so much. We have one last question, actually, we missed out, is Dr. Peace Bagasha from Uganda. Dr. Peace, can you ask your question?
Oh, sorry. So I had wanted to ask, so in resource limited settings, I'm from Uganda, so Uganda in particular, one of the things that really influences the patient's experience is the financial bit of dialysis. It's a very costly treatment. The government does not pay for dialysis in this setting. So I just wanted to know from your experience in Denmark, how much does the person's financial ability affect their experience of living with end-stage kidney disease?
Yes, that is very simple, because it does not affect their finances at all. So, and I know that, I knew that coming to talk to you people, that this would be one of the major differences, and I haven't really touched upon it because I feel so sad that people are not able to get the treatment that they're supposed to. But really, I mean, like I said at the very beginning of my presentation, I live an extremely privileged life because I do get my treatments for free. Well, that's just one aspect of it, but yeah. Does that answer your question? Or, I mean, I have a very hard time even thinking about how difficult it must be for your patients.
Yeah. Just just to clarify, so so government pays for other extra things, including things like transportation, medications, all those are catered for?
Yes, most of it is paid for by the government. There are certain medications that are not paid for. Transportation, you do get paid transportation. If you cannot transport yourself, you have to wait sometimes. That's one of the problems for some of our in-center patients, that they have to wait for up to, I think it's 3 or 4 hours either way. So that means in the worst case scenario, they are picked up 4 hours before the treatment, and then they have the treatment, and then it's another 4 hours before they get picked up. So basically, that is a 12-hour workday going to dialysis. I mean, that's the inconvenience that we're talking about here. But still, it's free.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lloyd, can I ask one more question?
Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Peace. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the key take-home messages that we have learned is to ask the patient what is important to you. So this is a question that we ask the patient. But then you have also said that many times the patient's mental health is affected. So because of either depression, fatigue, maybe it's part of the kidney disease itself. So how much weight will you put on what the patient wants? How do you know that what the patient wants is actually what they want, considering their mental health may not be in the right place?
That is a really good question. I would say most times the patient will know what they want. It may not seem, maybe it doesn't seem appropriate, or maybe it doesn't seem like the right thing for that person. But I put a lot of stake in people's autonomy. And sometimes what people want is definitely not what's best for them. And then we have to have a discussion about it. So you and your patient will have to and say, and you say, well, I think this is better for you, and so on and so forth. I think that's very fair, but I also think it's fair to consider what it is the patient wants, and maybe ask them, why do you want that? That seems very odd to me, because such and such. That can be a way of approaching it, at least. I just think it's important that the patient gets out of life what they would like out of life. And to some people, that is, let's say, drinking too much. Not something that we would like this person to see or do, but hey, it's what they want, and maybe that's what brings them joy, or drowns their sorrows, for that sake. And it can be difficult to be witness to. Like I said in my personal presentation, that I work with people with serious mental illness for a number of years, and among them were a lot of addicts, and it was terrible to see these addicts ruin their life day in and day out. But I also had to respect it, because that was how they coped with, many of them had schizophrenia, for example, and they felt better because they were addicts. And who am I to judge that? In fact, their psychiatrists often said, yeah, this person probably should remain an addict. This other person should probably try to stop. It's very difficult. But it's also difficult for the rest of us. How do we take care of ourselves? What is it that we want in life? So my best answer probably is, use your common sense and try to be empathetic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Well, I'm extremely grateful, Henning, for this wonderful presentation, and depicting the entire picture that we don't realize from the other end of the table, and that is a very, very important thing that has to be recognized, and that's probably not in the medical teaching as of now, and that needs to come in. It's a very, very important aspect that is not looked into, and thank you very much for enlightening us with all these aspects today. We also look forward to your next week's presentation. The aspect of mental health, which is extremely important, and this is actually, even to me, it's a lot of learning, because this was not stressed upon, as you rightly said. nephrologists are taught to treat kidney disease, but
Mhm.
not these aspects of the life of the patient. And that's a very important aspect. So we really look forward to. And thank you very, very much. It is really appreciated by all of us. And there's a lot of comments there, and a lot of us who really have learned a tremendous amount today. Thank you. Extremely grateful for your time, Henning. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all for listening. It has been my greatest pleasure, I will say.